Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and during our half-hour episodes, I interview writers about their craft. Sometimes they're poets, sometimes journalists, sometimes novelists, all sorts of writers about what they've done, what they're doing, what they might have planned for the future. We also have had other kinds of artists on. We've had musicians, we've had actors, we've had painters. It's a pretty wide net. If you have an idea for someone who might fit this wide net, writer or otherwise, please watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be glad to get your suggestion. I also want to say at the top of the show, watch for the address of theyatesgame.org after the credits. That's a play that began in Gloucester, went to Boston. It's premiering in New York in February. I think you'll be interested. theyatesgame.org. I'm very happy to say tonight we do have a distinguished writer, a journalist by the name of Doug Stewart, who has recently published a really fascinating crime novel about literary forgery titled The Boy Who Would Be Shakespeare, A Tale of Forgery and Folly. And we're going to be talking about that book and showing it to you. Doug Stewart is a freelance writer, a journalist who writes frequently about history and the arts for Smithsonian Magazine. His articles have also appeared in Time and Discover, and he's a resident of Ipswich right now. He is also, he just informed me before the show began, a frequent restaurant reviewer for the Boston Globe, something I wasn't aware of. Welcome to the Writer's Block, Doug.
Nice to be here, John.
Thanks for coming down. Before the show started, you gave me another surprise. You said your major at Harvard was not journalism, it was Middle Eastern languages and literature.
That's right.
How did you move from Turkish and Arabic to Shakespearean
I guess I would have to say I did a lot of sailing as a young man, and I parlayed that into a job at Sail Magazine in Boston. And so I was editing books on sailing, and then I worked on magazines, and then I became a freelance writer, sort of from the inside. And this was in the 80s when magazine publishing was extremely healthy. There were lots of new magazines, and it was a great time to be a freelancer. It's probably harder today.
Magazines seem to come and go with the frequency of the leaves. I think many people in Gloucester have been acquainted with Sailing Magazine over the years. You learned Turkish and Arabic. Have you done work in the Middle East?
No, I really haven't. I figured anything you do in college, if it's a liberal arts major, it's a liberal arts major. I'm not sure being an English major would be any more useful, or a journalism major. I mean, you can get a master's in journalism, but really you learn by doing. And I've bounced around the publishing world. I've been a book editor and a magazine editor as well as a writer, and that's really how you learn.
I asked this question of many writers because I'm interested in the sources of energy and creativity. Was there someone in your background educationally or in the family who made you open and expansive and feel comfortable with words?
No, not at all. I always loved to write, even when I was a little kid. I always played with writing, and I like to read. And I think probably the most important skill and pastime for a writer is to do a lot of reading. And the same with my magazine writing, which is mostly what I do. I try to write for magazines that I enjoy reading. And I think if you try to write for a publication you don't like, it's probably a big mistake.
You think it shows?
I think it does.
Now, the book I mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to hold up now. We're going to talk about it and make sure that all our viewers know where they can get it. This is Doug Stewart's book that I mentioned. I want to make sure I get the title correct. The Boy Who Would Be Shakespeare, A Tale of Forgery and Folly. And I assume this is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and local bookstores?
Yeah, and I should actually say, even though you could read this and assume it's a novel, and even though I wrote it like a novel, with sort of cliffhanger chapters and so on, it is a true story. It's absolutely true, even though the story itself is extremely far-fetched in that this was a teenage boy impersonating Shakespeare.
the kind of thing you couldn't make up.
Yeah, I would say so, right.
I mentioned to our wonderful camerawoman, Alexis, before the show, that this is about a youngster, a teenager, who commits one of the most famous, notorious literary hoaxes ever in the late 18th century. Can you give us the background?
Yeah, and it's something that people in England know about. I don't think people in this country do. I think it was probably the most brazen forgery in history, but it never got that much publicity later. What happened was, in the late 1700s, people in England had just recently agreed that Shakespeare was a matchless genius, a secular god. Until the late 1700s, people hadn't really paid that much attention. Shakespeare had been in eclipse. Well, once he became a god, they started looking for his papers and looking for any evidence from his lifetime of who he had been. Nobody could find anything. And then this teenage boy, who was very unaccomplished, his own father thought he was a dunce. He'd been a failure in school. He claimed he'd found Shakespeare's personal papers in an old trunk belonging to an anonymous gentleman. And instead of being surprised, people in England in the 1790s reacted by saying, "Oh, we were looking for those," because people couldn't believe all the papers had disappeared. But in fact, they had. Even today, no one has ever seen anything in Shakespeare's handwriting. Any of his works, any of his first drafts, no poetry, no letters, no diaries. Just a couple signatures on legal documents.
I was going to say I found something earlier today I want to talk to you about later, but I haven't. You talk about this in the book, and this fascinates me even in popular culture. What triggers a society's decision to raise a person into a godhead or an icon for a certain it happened to Sinatra, for instance.
Right.
Somewhere in the 50s or 60s, people started sort of bowing their head when you said Sinatra,
well, you can say,
and that happened to Shakespeare.
Right, and in a way, you could say that the idea of genius is not a trait like eye color. It's something that's given to you by other people, by agreement, including with Sinatra. It's not like everyone would hear his voice and say, "Oh, nobody can sing like that." And it's the same with Shakespeare. In his lifetime, he was not famous. He wasn't considered a genius. He certainly wasn't considered a god. He was a middle-class, ink-stained wretch working in a rather disreputable field, which was the public theater, where women weren't even allowed on stage. That's how disreputable it was. But a variety of factors came into play, and perhaps the most important was the rise of literacy. In Shakespeare's time, people in England were mostly illiterate. By the 1790s, 200 years later, everyone was going to school. People could read the plays, so they were reaching millions of people instead of a few thousand who could get into the Playhouse in London, where the plays were performed. And more than that, the British Empire had become a really big, powerful presence in the 18th century, which it wasn't in Queen Elizabeth's time. Shakespeare was the perfect example of English cultural superiority and creative genius. It was proof that there was no genius like English genius, especially vis-a-vis France, England's great enemy. So Shakespeare fit the bill that way.
Do you think he is more of a social phenomenon than a literary phenomenon? Maybe I'll rephrase that. Do you think Shakespeare is overrated because of these sociological factors?
I think he's overrated, certainly, even today, in the sense that I don't think he was a god. I think he was a mortal. I think he put his leggings on one leg at a time. I also think if you ask people today, could there be someone working in the theater today, say in New York or London, a young man or woman, who could possibly have Shakespeare's talent? Most people would say, of course not. And I think that's silly. Why couldn't there be?
Tom Stopper's pretty good.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe not as Shakespeare, but I think we use Shakespeare's name as shorthand for creative genius, just like literary genius, just like Leonardo in art, Mozart in music, Einstein in science.
Einstein is...
yeah, and we do that without really knowing what we're talking about. I don't think we today, or we people 200 years ago, knew Shakespeare that well, and that's why the forger succeeded. When people looked at the papers this boy had written, and this is a boy who had been a failure in school, had never published poetry before. He started writing poetry longhand, and then finally an entire play. The poet laureate looked at the play and wept to think he could never write that well. Well, you could say this is impossible, but the moral is people see what they want to see. They have been looking for Shakespeare's papers. When they found them, they were delighted. And more than that, this boy started filling in gaps in Shakespeare's biography, in his forgeries. Nobody knew anything about Shakespeare's life very much. Nobody, even today, knows what Shakespeare looked like. They don't know if he was tall, short, fat, skinny. And this boy started doing things like he forged a love letter to Shakespeare's wife, proving, finally, that he loved his wife, which there's no evidence of.
He turns out to be more proper than he may have been.
Right.
He loved his wife. He's an avid Protestant, not a secret Catholic.
Exactly.
And all this is because William wanted to, initially, wanted to please his father,
Right.
who was sort of an overbearing jerk.
Yeah, and a collector of rare books. So he started out, and this is true with many forgers today too. You start out small, maybe just to impress somebody or to cover up a mistake. And then your first prank works, and everyone's saying, wow, this is great. This really is Shakespeare. And why should you stop? Because people sometimes think, well, why wouldn't he stop while he's ahead? And you say that always with imposters and forgers. But people were praising this boy's writing as the real thing, as Shakespeare. Wouldn't you have your head swell? Wouldn't you think you were Shakespeare reborn? And I think that's what happened. He started getting these delusions of grandeur.
Kind of got out of control.
Yeah.
But eventually after initially saying, here's the signature, and having that gobbled up, he produces more and more and more, writes a play that's put on at the Drury Lane
Theatre Royal.
And well received by and large as a wonderful artifact.
Yeah, there were people all along who didn't believe the papers were real. There were others who thought they were sure they were attending the first Shakespearean premiere in 200 years, which was why the theater was not only standing room only, but the streets all around it were clogged with excited crowds. But I think the point is literary analysis is a very tricky thing. I don't think Shakespeare's genius just wafts off the page. You can read some of Shakespeare's actual work, like Venus and Adonis, the epic poem that he was better known for in his lifetime than any of his plays. And, it's pretty hard to get through. It's sensational. It's overwritten. It reads as though Shakespeare was being paid a penny a word, because it just goes on. And it's about a rape and its aftermath.
I haven't read that since grad school. I have no plans to read it. No plans to read it again.
Right, and I think we just assume that anything Shakespeare wrote was great, and actually it's kind of tricky to evaluate things. And even the reviewer for the London Times, who attended the premiere, wrote the following Monday that he couldn't tell whether it was Shakespeare or not. He suspected it wasn't because it didn't have any trashy parts. And Shakespeare's plays always had trashy parts.
Yeah, he gets pretty lewd.
Lewd, right, dirty jokes, puns, even blank verse or the use of apparitions was considered in Georgian England to be kind of improper.
Could you pick a passage out
Sure.
of the book that you might read to give us a flavor of the period? I believe this starts in, the fraud started in 1796?
1794 is when he claims to discover the pages. I could just read something from the beginning.
Okay, what page are you going to read from?
The bottom of page 1. And the first scene in the book is the first time the boy's overbearing father, Samuel Ireland, invites 2 literary men from London, supposed experts, to come over to their house, their townhouse in London, to see the papers this boy claims to have discovered in the old trunk. And his father was a dupe all along. William Henry Ireland was unaccustomed to attention. He was a quiet, unassuming boy who passed his time as an unpaid apprentice to a lawyer friend of the family. His father, Samuel, was a pompous, social-climbing writer, engraver, and collector of antiquities. To call on the Irelands at their comfortable home on the edge of London's theatre district was to step inside Samuel Ireland's peculiar cabinet of curiosities. Here and there were paintings by Hogarth and Van Dyck, rare 16th century books, a piece of a mummy's shroud, a Tahitian carpet made of bark, and a leather jacket worn by Puritan ruler Oliver Cromwell. And this part of this too is the idea of collecting rarities from notable people's lives was very much a new idea. People didn't bother doing it in Shakespeare's time. Now people were lusting for relics from Shakespeare's life. Samuel's latest and most remarkable acquisition, however, was the sheet of paper his son had ceremoniously handed him a month earlier. Worn at the edges and heavily creased, the paper was inscribed with florid handwriting and faded ink. Dated 2 centuries earlier, the document was an avowal of a religious faith. On it, the writer declared himself most solemnly a Protestant. At the bottom was a signature with embellished capitals, William Shakespeare. It was an astonishing discovery. William Shakespeare, who had died in relative obscurity in 1616, had lately risen in popular esteem to become England's matchless literary genius. Will of Stratford was now a secular god, the immortal bard. Yet aside from a few signatures, nothing written in Shakespeare's hand, not a letter, not so much as a couplet, had ever been found. If the yellowed note William Henry Ireland had discovered was genuine, it was the literary equivalent of the crown jewels. And it goes on from there.
And his father was ecstatic and pleased,
Yeah.
just as William had hoped.
Right, although to his surprise, the boy hadn't really planned things out that well. To his surprise, his father's real initial reaction was, "Where did you find these? I must meet this anonymous gentleman." And his son, of course, could not arrange a meeting with this man he called Mr. H. So he told his father, "Look, why don't you write him a letter and I'll give it to Mr. H." And in researching the book, I went to the British Library, to the manuscripts room, and you can see the letters that the father and son wrote to each other, where Samuel is writing to Mr. H, and then William Henry is writing back to Samuel in disguised handwriting as Mr. H, just ignoring the father's demands for more papers and just saying things like, "You know, your son is really remarkable. He's a brilliant poet, too. Have you read his poetry? And by the way, I hear you don't approve of his long hair, but don't you think he should have hair in the style of our Willie?" Meaning Shakespeare.
It's incredible that didn't trigger immediate guffaws.
Well, his father wanted to believe, and of course, the story the son gave was that Mr. H was willing to relinquish these papers because Mr. H didn't care about these old dusty papers and didn't even admire Shakespeare. Not everyone did. So all these papers were going right into Samuel's collection, which would make him wealthy, make him famous, and so he wanted to believe. It was wishful thinking from the get-go.
I want to mention that the book contains some nice black and white prints and photographs. Here is a sample of 2, and also a good map of, I don't know if this is late medieval or...
The map is from 1795.
1795, so this is
Exactly.
Georgian London with locations of where the Irelands lived, and something that seems remarkable to me is that the theater district hasn't moved at all.
Yeah.
It's right in the same area.
Exactly.
And of course, many of the theaters by name are still there, not the physical structures, but Drury Lane certainly still exists.
And Covent Garden.
Covent Garden.
Yeah.
And they lived on Northumberland Street for a
Norfolk
while.
Street, yeah.
Which is right near where I often stay.
Oh, really? Right off the Strand.
Weren't they on Northumberland for a while
No.
next to Craven before Norfolk or somebody?
It was Arundel, although all these things, Northumberland, Norfolk, and Arundel, were named after earls who used to have mansions along there, along the
Somerset.
Thames. Yeah, Somerset, sure.
There's a chapter here I want to touch on that has to do with the similarities between the past and the present again, like the theater district not moving, and it has to do with money. Sheridan needed a hit,
Yeah.
you talk about,
Right.
and he was essentially broke, if I remember
Right,
correctly.
yeah, Richard Brinsley Sheridan
The
was the impresario of the
playwright.
Drury Lane Theatre.
Yes,
Yeah.
and a very accomplished, especially comedic poet, playwright himself.
Right.
Tell us about how that developed.
Right. Well, Sheridan, as a playwright, possibly was jealous of Shakespeare because Shakespeare's plays had become so popular, it was actually hard for a contemporary playwright to have his own plays performed. But nonetheless, Sheridan had just expanded his theater. It was now the biggest theater in London, biggest theater in England, and he was more than $1 million in debt. He was also a gambler and a drinker and very much a free spender. So he was trying to recoup his investment in the theater, which he was a part owner of, as well as the theater manager. Since the new expanded theater had opened the year before the story takes place, he'd never had a sellout. And he'd had problems with some of the plays, where the plays were not well received. So even though he didn't think much of this play the boy had written, which was supposedly Shakespeare's, he said, well, if Shakespeare wrote this, he must have been a very young man. But he didn't really care about the quality. He cared about it was going to be this sensation, and that people would flock to the theater, which they did, to attend a new work by Shakespeare, unknown to the world.
So money ruled.
Money ruled for sure, as it always does, I suppose. And the other part of this, even just a few years before, Samuel Johnson, who had recently died, said that even if a new play of Shakespeare surfaced, he thought it would not be well received. Because what was being produced in those days as Shakespeare, like King Lear, was performed on the same stage 1 year before the story happened. But it was drastically rewritten by a poet laureate named Nahum Tate earlier in the century, giving King Lear a happy ending. That's what the Georgian audience wanted. So that's part of the reason for the boy's success. People who claimed to love Shakespeare really weren't sure what Shakespeare had written.
I thought this chapter was a wonderful kind of insight, apart from the story of the forgery, into the raw roots of early Western capitalism. You know,
Right.
We don't care if it's any good. If we can put people in the seats,
Right.
we'll present it.
And the other thing is there's really strong parallels between the theater crowds in these days and Premier Soccer League spectators today in England with the hooliganism. People in the theater, and there's a picture in the book from the 1780s at the Drury Lane with people who are just talking, they've got their dogs, they're flirting, they're not even watching what's going on. And Jane Austen writes about that in Pride and Prejudice. There's a scene where Elizabeth Bennet's talking to her aunt in a theater, and they're talking during the play. That's what people did. So how carefully can they be listening to the dialogue? How carefully are they able to evaluate what they're seeing? And it's like people singing and swaying at a soccer game. They're just they're there either to support one side or to oppose it, and that's what happened.
Or trying to perform in a loud nightclub.
Oh boy!
I just got the 5-minute signal from Alexis. If I may, I'd like to ask you a quick technical question.
Sure.
What would you advise writers who are watching who want to get into journalism? What 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 steps they can quickly take?
Well, as I said at the outset, the important thing is to do a lot of reading. And we've been talking about a book, and I have to say I don't really know that much about being an author because it's my first book, but one thing I know a lot about is magazine work because I've been doing it for almost 30 years. And I would say that if you are going to pitch ideas to a magazine, the most important thing is to know the magazine. And every magazine is different. So the best thing you can do is subscribe. If you don't want to spend money on a subscription, go to the library. Read the last 12, if not 24 issues. Find out the style, find out what they've been publishing, find out how they're different from their competition.
So do your homework and research and find out what the market is after.
Right. When I was a magazine editor, if someone sent me a query letter with queries, and it became clear when I read it that they didn't know what we had just been publishing, I would just throw it out. I wouldn't even answer it.
I just got the 3-minute signal about a minute ago from Alexa, so I'm going to have to begin to wrap up. Doug Stewart, thank you very much for coming down and sharing The Boy Who Would Be Shakespeare with us. It was very, very enjoyable half hour. Appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure, John.
Thank you out there in TV land, too, for being with us on the Writer's Block. If you've learned something about this bizarre forgery perpetrated by William Ireland back in the 1790s, then the writer's block has done its job. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next week on the writer's block. Good night.